Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel Zalewski, an executive editor at the magazine, and welcome to the New Yorker Festival. Anyway, without further ado, I would like to begin this panel on the art of the profile. The journalists here, and it's Ian Parker, Kelefa Sanneh, Larissa MacFarquhar, Rebecca Mead, and Michael Schulman. They're all portraitists, and in the same way that we enjoy looking at a Hans Holbein or an Alice Neel portrait for the psychological tension between the subject and the painter, and for the forceful imposition of style on that image, we enjoy a New Yorker profile, both for what it reveals about its subject and for how the writer shapes his or her insights. You know, if the profile makes all of its moves as predictably as a wind-up toy. You know, a vignette on the subject at the beginning, then all the backstory, beginning with Mr. Zalewski was born in suburban Maryland. You know, then assembles quotes from secondary sources and then ends with a witty quote from the subject. We're bored, even if the subject is endlessly fascinating. These writers are all very different, but what unites them, I think, is that they're all engaged in what Martin Amis has called the war against cliché. They've all read mountains of profiles, and they probably disliked many of them, but they love the challenge of doing one well, with merciless and empathic observation, wise assessment, and pleasurably distinctive prose. There can be a danger of arrogance and unfairness in summing up another human being, even in 12,000 words. And I think these writers are all aware of those risks, and they innovate in part to elude them. So anyway, let's begin. Part of what's pleasurable about the profile as a genre, in some ways, is that like a painting portrait, it's sort of a competitive genre. Other journalists have often written profiles of people, and you're often writing about someone about whom readers have opinions. And I guess, you know, when you begin writing about someone, how much do you try to absorb the received wisdom on a subject, and how much do you try to block it out?
I mean, I think one has to read the other pieces that came before. It can be a bit, you can start to feel, oh my God, there is nothing new to say, everything has been said, and now I know everything, and I'm not interested in them anymore. I've read everything about them, and that's quite enough. But there's something about I think, the chemistry and the dynamic when you get into the room with the person and you start to talk to them and they start to unfold as a real, you know, human being, that is so exciting and so interesting that you no longer feel that there's nothing to say about them. And, you know, and you have to, I mean, if somebody is agreeing to do this thing and they're giving you their time, you know, the least that you can do is know the things about them that are already in the public domain as much as you can, even if you want to ask them to tell the story of their childhood yet again, because you want to intervene and ask questions, or you want to have it in their voice, not filtered through some other profile. But I think, sometimes I think subjects are surprised to discover that you have read as much and thought as much about them as, you know, I think most of us do before we go in the room. Unless anybody here is going to say, I walk in knowing nothing because I just want to trust my instincts.
Well, I was wondering if you ever feign ignorance, right? Like you've read the stuff about their childhood and then you have to ask them about their childhood. You ask them as if you don't know anything about their childhood?
Yeah, pretty much. Until I then might like with the follow-up question. What about you? What do you do?
Yeah, I feign ignorance. Sometimes I do forget, so sometimes it's real ignorance.
I mean, surely the problem is not how much you know, but their knowledge of themselves. Like, you know, that's why it's so much harder to, I think, interview someone who's famous and who's been interviewed a million times, because there are certain questions you're going to have to ask, regardless of how many times you've read their answers before. And because they're not crazy, they're going to say some of the same things, because that's the answer to the question. And the trick of trying to rephrase it or ask a different question that's sort of off to the side so that they have the chance to say something that they haven't said a million times before, that's difficult sometimes.
That feeling that you're meeting somebody who you might have a lot of preconceptions about, but then you meet them for the first time. People surprise us. They reveal something about themselves that they didn't expect. But sometimes there's a real swerve, a real divergence between like the public persona that someone might have and what they're like as a person. Do either of you remember a moment when you like really felt like the person who I'm meeting in a face-to-face encounter is really different from either the persona that they projected or their reputation that maybe had been kind of unfairly imposed on them?
I'm always expecting that, and then when it doesn't happen, I'm surprised. Like, I'm always surprised that people are more like their persona than I expect, right? Yeah. It's like, oh, I'm at Kid Rock's house in Detroit. This is exactly how I thought it was going to be. Or even like, I'm talking to Chris Rock, and he's just like Chris rocking into the microphone for an hour, and it's great. And so, yes, I'm always surprised. I'm like, oh, people are a little bit more like I think they're going to be than they actually are.
Sometimes they're so much like themselves and so much like you think they're going to be that that first meeting is often just like they're performing themselves and you're listening, just smiling and being nice to make them feel more comfortable for the second meeting or whatever it is. I mean, there was one occasion, I won't say who, but there was somebody I was interviewing where I met them in Los Angeles. We went to lunch in a restaurant, and I realized at the end of the lunch, during which they had told me all the things that I'd already read in every other profile, that my tape recorder hadn't been working at all, and the whole thing had been lost. But it didn't matter at all, because they hadn't said anything that wasn't already the same thing that they'd already said. And that was back in the days when we had to do, before the glories of AI transcription, where we had to do our own transcription. So that was like an hour and a half of tape I didn't have to listen to, which is so good. So I was grateful. I was really pleased. I recommend that as a technique.
I had this great first meeting with Ridley Scott a couple years ago, who has a reputation. He's not an actor performer, but he's a big gruff man, and he was 87, I think, at the time, and coming out with 2 new movies, just this boundless energy. But when I got to his office in LA, he had in his office framed the 1982 pan that Pauline Kael gave Blade Runner in The New Yorker. And before I had arrived, he had asked his assistants to lay the 8-page pan framed on the conference table for me to look at. And I was thrilled. I was like, this is great. We're taking revenge on Pauline. This is why he's doing this. Because he wants to get back in those pages and have it his way and say it his way. And, screw Pauline. She's dead. And so, it was a very Ridley Scott thing to do, to sort of, go to war as part of this profile. But I was in heaven. And every time we parted, I would say, Ridley, we're taking revenge on Pauline. You're going to get the last word. And like revenge I can work with. It was good stuff.
Did you really say that?
Yeah. I want to keep him interested. And he was one of those profile subjects who didn't really understand that we keep showing up. It's not one interview. We're going to keep showing up. And then he was suddenly like, I was chasing him all over the world, because one day he'd be in LA, and then he'd go to London where he has an office, and then I flew to London, and then they told me, oh, he's actually at his vineyard in Provence. So I was like, okay, I guess I need the New Yorker to send me to Provence real fast. And then I show up at his vineyard, and he was shocked that I was there, because he just didn't understand that I was going to keep showing up. And then at the end, he goes, you're in depth, like me. So there was a sort of respect to it.
Well, that's obviously one of the unusual things about the profile writing process, is that sometimes think of the Financial Times' lunch with X kind of encounter. That allows for a certain kind of either sort of mischief or surface equality to the discussion, because it's 90 minutes and you're over and out. But the very work that you're doing is sort of going back and kind of establishing a sort of relationship of sorts that, but the breakup we all know is coming. And I guess I wonder, how do you sort of handle the fact that with every subject that we write about, there are easy questions. There are the questions, as you say, like that, Ridley Scott is just dying to answer and, pontificate about. And then there are questions that are difficult, maybe things that you've reported about them or, somebody has told you about them. Do either of you have a policy or kind of, protocol for how you unfurl that information? The Janet Malcolm narrative, the obligatory mention here would be that we all kind of wait until the end for the difficult moments and maybe even allow the fact checkers to handle it rather than in person. But do you actually ever try to say, indicate to the subject that what you're asking is a mix of questions that are, in some ways softballs, easy, and then ones that are interrogating? Do you try to establish that you're not, in some ways, their friend?
I think, doesn't it depend on how much experience they have with the media?
Yeah.
Right? So the more famous and seasoned someone is, the more you might, on the contrary, want to establish that you are their friend, or you are friendly with them, or that you are interested in them, right? And there's something flattering about someone being that interested in you. And that's something that I think can help all of us when we're doing this, right? It's like, well, it might not always be literally flattering attention, but I am paying close attention to you. And I think most people feel like if they get a chance to really explain themselves to someone thoughtful, like they're gonna come out looking pretty good because we'll understand them. And so, yes, I would, if I was talking to someone that didn't know that much about the media, I'd be careful to explain to them, like, I'm gonna ask you about all sorts of things, this is not a friendship, but usually it's a little more the opposite. And I'm saying, honestly, like, no, I'm really interested in you. And like, let's talk, hopefully let's have a conversation where when it gets to the difficult questions, that feels organic. It feels like I'm asking you the difficult question because it's arising out of the close attention I've been paying to what you're saying, rather than like it's the next thing on my notepad. Or let's do it maybe in a context that feels less like an interview, right? Like maybe we're driving, maybe we're just hanging out, maybe it's late night, maybe the recorder is not blinking on the table. Yeah. So, yeah.
Sitting alongside rather than face to face with
yes.
people, those questions become easier. You want to be on an airplane or on a train or a car.
Yep, that's why they have us sitting alongside each other right now, so we can really ask each other the tough
but it's
questions.
sort of parallel to the way that, like, having a discussion with a teenager or something is very much easier if you're like both in a car and you're not looking at one another directly. And there is a way where you have to think about those things because it's an unusual form of conversation. Now, we're obviously talking in many ways about the profile as an act, as a kind of pas de deux, two people like sitting in a room talking with each other. Now that happens, but I know that all of you, in some ways, crave the moment outside of that, when you can get what my colleague Henry Finder often calls, borrowing from the cinematic lexicon, the two-shot, where you can actually get your subject interacting with other people and you're just watching it. That's really difficult to orchestrate, I have found. But like, what's a way that you try to both explain to the subject that that's what you need, and if any of you just kind of think of like a moment when you got exactly that and it was so satisfying, where you felt, not only was it like a little drama that you were witnessing, but that it was sort of revealing of character.
For me, I did a lot of Talk of the Town before I started writing profiles, and that was the perfect training for this because Talk of the Town pieces are not sit-down interviews. They are scenes out in the world, and I always try to find something in a profile that somehow resembles that. For instance, I just recently profiled Patti LuPone, and before I met her, I was doing some research on her, and found out to my shock that in the 80s, or like late 70s, early 80s, when she was in Evita, she would constantly go to Rangers games. And she would hang out with the Rangers. And there were these like photos of her with Rangers players, like and they would go to Evita and see her musical. And I was like totally charmed by this. And no one ever writes about, Patti LuPone's interest in hockey. So when I sat down with her the first time, I was asking her a lot of questions about this and saying, oh, we need to come up with an activity. Let's do some fun activity around New York. And then as we were walking out, as I hoped she would, she said, I know, why don't we go to a Rangers game? I'll call and get tickets. And then the next day, I get this voice memo from her that's saying, Michael, what are you doing tomorrow night? Rangers versus Toronto Maple Leafs. Puck drop is at 7 o'clock. And then suddenly we are like second row at Madison Square Garden watching the Rangers, and it just brings something out of her that is so amazing. And I'm watching Patty just scream at the players like, take it off, I want to see naked hockey. Full frontal. And then my favorite, and then she would complain about the Jumbotron. She'd be like, don't tell me what to feel. And then during one of the breaks in the game, there was this, what do you call it? Not gazebo, a Zamboni came out with these, so I'm not a sports person. I'm not a sports person.
Not a
I
sports
only
reporter.
go to team sports when there's a Broadway diva with me, yelling, take it off. But the Zamboni comes out with these two kids who've won a contest that lets them sit on the back of the Zamboni, and the announcer announces all that, and she just screams, who gives a shit? And that was when I was like, this profile is cooking. I love this.
Absolutely. No, and the scene kind of ends with her also like getting bored and walking out in the middle of the game. You know, yeah, you just can't orchestrate that kind of material without sort of getting somebody sort of comfortable with you. Rebecca, do you have like a memory of such a situation?
Nothing even approximately approaching that. But what it does show me, it's so interesting because, of course, Michael and I are friends and known each other forever, but I can imagine what it must be like to be being profiled by you, and the energy that you give off when you're talking to somebody. They must just be, oh my God, this is so amazing, and just like be captivated, and then and then they read it. But I think it's, and they're all incredible pieces, of course. I'm sure that some of the people that Michael writes about are very happy. Really, I'm sure.
Many are.
Yes.
But I think, we all must just give such a different vibe when we go into the room with somebody. I mean,
Janet Malcolm very famously talked about being intimidatingly silent and just letting people, inevitably in her pieces kind of hang themselves with their quotes. But she was also, when you look back on it, she was also probably exploiting the fact that she was a woman, and she was often profiling arrogant men who, didn't necessarily want to hear her point of view, and so it was actually a very effective strategy for her to be recessive.
Yeah.
And that's part of the theater of a profile, is that you are reading what the subject thinks of you.
I remember reading about Joan Didion. I've never met her, so I don't know this for sure personally, but I remember reading that she wasn't putting things on like Janet Malcolm. She was genuinely extremely shy, and she was a very small person physically. And I remember reading how she would get into the room with the subject and she would just freeze and not say anything. And that's so uncomfortable, and the person would be so anxious by her anxiety that they would just start blathering and just start saying anything to fill the space. And, I don't think it was a technique in her case, but it certainly made a difference.
Can I say something about just sort of how to be with a subject?
Yeah.
Because, there's this line from The Sopranos that I always think of. When, I think it's season 2, Tony decides that he has fallen in love with Dr. Melfi in therapy, and he tells her this, and she says something like, I've been a broad, generic, sympathetic woman to you because that's what this work calls for. And I always think about that. Like, I'm being a broad, sympathetic woman to these people, like whatever they need, but that's always a different thing. And, I feel like the part of it is like, I'm pretty like extrovert or whatever, like the way I'm being now, but I can turn it off and do turn it off, especially when it's gonna intrude. For instance, I had this year where I was profiling Jeremy Strong and Wendy Williams at the exact same time. Yeah. You could not find two more different human beings. Yeah. And Jeremy, you can talk for, he doesn't want sense of humor. He wants it to be like a mission that you're on together. It's a serious endeavor because everything he does, he takes with great seriousness. And so anytime I'd try to crack a joke, it'd be like, blank stare. And he speaks in a very abstract way about acting. Wendy, and I say this in the best possible way, does not think abstractly. She is entirely materialistic, again, in a wonderful way. She wants to talk about her clothes, her wigs, the stuff in her apartment, her cats, and like, I just remember feeling, okay, like these are two very different ways of interacting with someone, and I can't force the other one on, you know, on the wrong person. And that's not like being a chameleon. I think that's just a basic social skill that we all have, whether it's going to a party or going on a date or something. You kind of try to read what will get someone going, and then relate to them on that level.
I was reading the new Ian McEwan novel the other day, and it has a moment where there's a character in it who's a major poet, and there is, it's frequently referred to a sort of profile in Vanity Fair, not the New Yorker, in which the poet is reduced to basically, you think he's a mean old grumpus, but on the inside, he's a sweetheart. And you know, the implication is that, of course, this is what profile writers do in some ways, is banalize a subject. You know, they kind of turn people into stories. I think, you know, in some ways, you guys are aware of that. Like the being too pat is the kind of thing that you don't want to do. How do you try to guard against that? How do you try, like a good novelist, to create a profile? You know, and I think that, Michael, you do this even with pieces that have like caused a storm. Have different readers come away with different impressions.
I mean, I think that everyone is interesting. So I've actually never worried about that. I've never worried about someone appearing boring or banal. I mean, the trick is what Rebecca was saying. If you're dealing with somebody who is well known, the trick is to not just reproduce what they've said before, both because people may have read it before, but also because it just sounds unspontaneous. They've said these things many times before, and that's not their fault. They've been asked the same questions. What are they supposed to do? It's very different if you're interviewing someone who is not famous. And that's, I mean, going back to what we were saying earlier, I feel protective of somebody who doesn't know what it feels like to see their words in an article. You know, it's very different. Like if you're interviewing a politician and they say something that they're going to be embarrassed about later, fantastic. You know, like put it right in, encourage more. But if it's not a politician, and especially if it's a private person, you know, I feel like this is my article is so much less important than their life, obviously. And the last thing I want on my conscience is for them to just be hideously embarrassed. So I think the quality of attention that we all bring, regardless of what kind of person it is a kind of, it's an intoxicating thing, and you have to be careful not to make someone reveal something that they don't actually want to reveal if they are not a politician.
But you also do something in your pieces in particular that comes across as sympathetic, I think, which is that you let people talk. You probably use longer quotes in your profile than any of the rest of us. And there is something in there where when I'm reading that, I feel like that's you telling me, just sit for a moment in this person's brain and spend some time, and if you read these like longer quotes about how they think, you're gonna learn something about this person, and it's not gonna feel like, oh, this is just my angle on this person. You're gonna feel like, yeah, I've really spent time inside their skull.
Well, it depends who the person is. I mean, like when I'm reading about Kid Rock and you're writing about Kid Rock, I want to hear about you. Like I am actually, I mean, that says something more about me, but like I want, you know, you have such a depth of knowledge about the history of music and all these different genres of music, and you can parse the sub-genres. That's more interesting to me than
well, this
what
is
Kid
a
Rock
little
has
awkward
to
because
say.
he's actually here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen.
Like, I mean, if it, you know, it's more interesting. I want to hear your view of him.
Well, yeah, and
so it depends on the person.
Yes, and that obviously is part of what we do, right, is that we have a view, and that's part of what's weird about this collaboration, right? We're asking the person to trust us, and we're going to say some true stuff about you, but obviously it's going to have our own opinion. And there's this whole thing that happens that's usually not on the page, which is like convincing people to let us do this, right? One of the first I came to the magazine in 2008, and I think it was the next year, I wanted to profile this radio talk show host, Michael Savage, considered to be politically on the right. And I emailed him, and he would read my email to him on the air and ask his listeners if the Marxist left-wing New Yorker magazine should be allowed to profile him. And then he would take callers, and the callers would call in with their opinion, and then he would write me back. And we did this a few times. And that's an unusual example of that. But often there is a kind of dance. And so one thing that I wonder when I read all of your profiles is like that part of it. Like, Rebecca, when you're in communication with the representatives of Shaquille O'Neal, what are you telling them?
That was so long ago, I can barely remember. But I do feel like, I mean, I looked back at that, but this is the profile I did of Shaquille O'Neal. I don't remember exactly what year it was, but I went to his 30th birthday party, so it was a long time ago. And, looking back at it, I feel like I went all over the country with him. I went all over the place with him. So there must have been like quite a lot of access. But
that's the art of the profile, right? You have like four little glimpses, and you make it feel like you spent a whole year with them.
Yeah, but it did feel. I don't imagine he was an avid reader of the New Yorker. I did go to his 30th birthday party at his house, which was amazing, but there were no magazines. There were no copies of the New Yorker lying on the coffee table. Actually, the coffee table would have been up here, so I wouldn't have been able to see one. No, I mean, I think in a way, maybe it has gotten harder, all of that negotiation stuff. What do you think?
With the politics stuff.
No, I was going to say,
go ahead.
I remember writing to Christopher Hitchens to suggest a profile. And I got a reply kind of 20 minutes later saying, "What took you so long?" You know, it was really, he was waiting for it. And that sometimes it's easy, and you don't have to make a case, and it's the New Yorker, and yes, I am ready to do that.
Do you find that you're often...
You can be completely honest. I mean, like, I remember interviewing a Trump voter as a Trump voter. I mean, he was not incidentally a Trump voter in West Virginia in 2016, and he was looking at me skeptically, and I was like, look, you have a notion about what New York journalists are. I am everything you think I am. Every cliche, that's me. But this piece is not about me. It's about you, and I'm going to do my best to, just represent you fairly. And, because he was not stupid. He knew exactly what I was thinking. He knew I wouldn't agree with him. And, if you're honest about it, I think they will accept that.
Well, you bring up another interesting aspect of profiles, is just sometimes, like say Ian has often written about architecture, something that I know that he is very knowledgeable about, and which he feels like a tremendous, basic intellectual comfort with. Like when he profiles Bjarke Ingels or Norman Foster, that's an area that he's thought about for a long time. Then there are times when you guys are asked to profile something, someone whose work or area of interest or politics is very foreign. And do any of you enjoy doing the thing where I imagine, Rebecca, when you profiled Shaquille O'Neal.
I know everything about basketball.
Yeah.
Actually, I knew more then than I certainly do now, and I knew more than you might think. But
I think you enjoy the process of the kind of self-educating and rapid immersion that a journalist must do, and it doesn't embarrass you or cause you discomfort. Do any of you kind of prefer to stay within zones that you really sort of know well? I think, Kay, that's...
I never feel like an expert compared to the people we're profiling. Like, you might have spent a lot of time as a journalist, learning about a thing, but that's not the same as someone who's done that thing every day for 40 years. So no matter how well I know something, if I'm in someone else's world, I'm a dabbler. And ultimately, I'm a translator, and I'm trying to explain to everyone else, like you telling readers what the hack-a-shack strategy is, right? That's what we're doing, right? We're like, oh, here's what they do, here's how it works in that world, and it's got to make sense to someone who's outside that world, and we're somewhere in between, where you've done the research, but as a journalist, you're almost a dabbler by definition.
Yeah, and you're still interested in the things that people who are in that world just totally take for granted, but to you are just, wow, that's such a weird thing that you do in that world of yours. Let me explain it.
Yeah, and it's always, it's not, there comes a point where it's not that interesting to describe a filmmaker's work. We all read that and seen it, 2 takes, 3 takes. So it's always fantastic when you are just learning about something completely new, and the experience of the reporting is the learning. So I read about Pete Wells, the restaurant reviewer of the New York Times, then the restaurant reviewer, and it's like this whole, there's a kind of his scheduling, you know, his tradecraft, his disguises, the kind of the names he booked restaurants under. All of that is just sort of fantastically interesting in the way that writing about a novelist, or, I mean, you can write about how writers write in a way that's magical, but it's just incredibly hard, like it's just somebody sitting at a page writing, but yeah.
But most people
Different
don't.
disguises.
But most people don't have a great sense of what's interesting about what they do, and even what's interesting about who they are, right? Like, it's pretty common for me, and probably for many of us, that you talk to someone and they want to tell you their theory of life, and the thing is, and really, when you look at it, and that's always the least interesting thing, right? It's like, how do you, what do you do when you wake up in the morning? Like, what are the professional, what are you worried about? How do you advance in your career? Like, often those small things are the most interesting that they think are kind of banal and boring, maybe because they do it so well or so often, whatever the thing is.
Let's talk a little bit about the craft of profiles. One of the things that people often who love the form talk about with one another is the lead. Even more than in a documentary. I mean, because now there's Netflix and things like that, but when you go to a play or to a movie, it takes a little force of will to like walk out after 3 minutes. But like, a work of journalism needs to be seductive instantly. Or you're going to turn the page. And I think we've all sat on a subway and watched someone do that with one of our pieces with dismay. So you get conditioned to sort of want to like...
It gets better.
Yes, exactly. So...
Sorry, it's so long.
The question, in some ways, is do some of you, write the lead after, doing the carpentry of other parts of the piece, or, do any of you have the feeling of like, I cannot write the piece until I have figured out how I want to begin?
Yeah, that's me. I mean,
Okay,
I have to be able to, I mean, I end up writing the whole thing in a sentence at the beginning. And I think other writers, there's a fantastic line in your Kid Rock piece where you kind of summarize the way kind of hip hop allowed him to kind of find his way to a white identity. I would put that at the beginning, and then I would, because I wouldn't have the kind of patience to get to it, because it's just anxiety, I think. It's like Larissa sort of opens a door and kind of come into my world. You will meet interesting people, and I'm kind of, would you like some nuts? I've got nuts.
Right. So putting a shiny thing up top.
And also, it kind of, I think, to be honest, it probably makes you look more astute than you are if you put it at the top. Because, like when Sherlock Holmes says, oh, I think you've come from Croatia and you got the 434 from Charing Cross. It's like, how did you know that, Sherlock? And it's like, and then they have to explain it's because you've got a Croatian badge on your lapel.
Right.
It's the same. It's like you look, and then if the evidence follows the deduction, then you look possibly wiser than if you put it at the end.
I always think of what I think of as one of the unofficial mottos of the magazine is don't get fancy. And so often, if I'm reading something in some other publication and they have some convoluted lead and the chronology's jumping around, I'm like, ugh. And so often, like, the thing you should put, for me, the thing that works at the beginning of the story is like the first thing that happened. Like, you start at the beginning, you meet the person, and then you say, like, what happened in the order it happened. Sometimes I find I can improve on that, but often I realize I can't really improve on that.
I mean, I think what we all do, consciously or unconsciously, is lean really heavily on the New Yorker as an institution, because I feel like, we have readers who know that our articles are really freaking long and are there for that, and so
not as long as they used to be. That's what people don't understand.
That's true, but I think that you have the leeway to do something that doesn't grab someone by the neck in the first paragraph. Sometimes that's exactly what you want to do. I'm looking at you and Edward St. Aubin, which really grabs you by the neck. But you don't have to, because I think people who've been reading the magazine for a while know that, okay, it may seem kind of boring at the beginning, but like we're going to get there, and they're not going to be really annoying, and it's not going to be super pretentious because the editors have taken that out, and like, you know, we're gonna get there eventually, and I definitely lean on that.
That is definitely one of the aspects, you know, being an editor at the magazine, where the fact that we have real readers as the audience, we don't have that sort of panicked anxiety that, you know, like the very structure of other magazines where it's like pull quotes, photographs, you know, everything that's kind of, you know, headline that's very, you know, they're kind of conveying, you know, stuffing everything that's tantalizing at the front. I mean, you know, I noticed rereading your Patti LuPone piece that the stuff that was going to end up on page 6 is at the very, very end of the piece, in which there's a discussion of her frustration with Audra McDonald. And you know, what's great about that is that it not only is an expressive confidence in some ways, of writerly confidence, that like you're building towards that and you're not saying, oh, I'm going to drop the bomb at the beginning, but actually it also is the fairest way to present that material, because you presented her as somebody who, very movingly, is kind of constantly gnawed at by injustices that she's felt from the past. You know, she's walking around her apartment, like, you're still fuming at the director of Evita and like mean things that he had said to her, and that you kind of believe were mean and scarring. And so then when she kind of lashes out at the end, it's both like the coup de grace in terms of like her irascibility, but we also kind of feel for her as somebody who is damaged.
That's true. I mean, that was also the last chronological thing that happened in my time with her.
Yeah.
So it made sense to put that at the end, but I do agree with you. Like, I wanted it to be in the context of, okay, she's still angry at her mother and for not telling her how her grandfather really died, and she's angry at Hal Prince from, you know, 45 years ago and for something else, and she's angry at the people next to her for talking too loud. And so when you get to like her going off on Audra McDonald and Keisha Lewis, you kind of, it's like in this context, and I felt a bit two ways about when that paragraph would get screenshot and put on social media, because I knew that would happen. It obviously did happen. She then had to apologize for it. There was like a petition going around about it. And, you know, part of me is like, great. It's like people are noticing this. It's being talked about. But on the other hand, I didn't want it to be a screenshot. I wanted it to be, you know, page 8 of a reading experience. The other thing I'll say about structure, and I can use that piece as an example, is I've been thinking lately, and I'm curious if you guys, if anyone feels this way as well, is that I've been focusing a little less on the lead. Like, to me, the lead is like, it's like the kindling that just gets you going. You just have to keep, you know, something that just gets you to paragraph 2, and is interesting and hooky, but like, I don't know, I'm trying not to overthink it so much. For me, like, the power moment of the piece is much more the very end of the first section, because I feel like that's when the reader has to commit to this piece in a deeper way. And so I try to put something really powerful there. But for instance, with Patti LuPone, it was when we were out eating, she was eating fried artichokes, and she was like tearing it up like a wild animal. It was great. And then and talking about how life had treated her unfairly, and she says something like, you know, I don't know what I did in the past life that I'm atoning for in this life. I just don't understand. Seriously, why wasn't it easier? And that, I was like, that has to be the end of the first section, because that tells you this deeper thing that she's struggling with. And we're going to unpack, why wasn't it easier for her? Is she correct?
When she said that in the moment, did you picture those words in New Yorker typeface?
Yeah. I'm like, check, you know, let's get the check. Let me pay for this artichoke and we'll go.
Section break. You can imagine.
But I find, you know, for instance, with Jeremy Strong, that spot, which I think of as like a really key spot, was a quote, it was Adam McKay, I think, saying he doesn't treat it like comedy, he treats it like he's playing Hamlet. And the idea of ending with the word Hamlet, it's like, okay, you're getting someone who has like this Shakespearean sense of himself. I mean, one of my favorite New Yorker profiles of all time, let me gush for a moment, is Ian's profile of Alec Baldwin from 2008. I go back to it all the time, Ian. It's brilliant. It's like he's at the height of his 30 Rock resurgence, and yet he feels constantly, the words you use are thwarted if not persecuted. And the headline was, "Why me?" Yes. It was just so great. And There's so many things I love about it, but I looked recently and thought, okay, what is at the end of section 1? And it was a quote where he's talking about why he wants to be a radio DJ, and he says, which he is, and he says something like, I'm tired of being other people. I just want to be me. I want to be myself. It was this sort of like existential cry from Alec Baldwin. And of course, when you hit that, and then you get a drop cap for section 2, you're like, I'm reading. Like, let's go.
No, there's a real, actually, kind of connection between that piece and the pilot poem piece, because at the end of the Alec Baldwin piece, in a very calm but loaded way, Ian observes that they've just gone on a lovely sort of boat ride out in the Hamptons.
You always need a boat ride.
Yeah. What?
You always need a boat ride.
Yeah, you need a boat ride. And in other words, the kind of thing that most people would enjoy. And then the second he gets off on land, he picks up his cell phone and he's like, Wait, what's happening with my assistant? What's going on? When am I going to get that paper? When? What's next? And it just kind of ends almost like in this Molly Bloom level, just kind of blur of words.
What else? He's repeating to his assistants.
Yeah, what else?
What else? What else? What else? What else? What else? And the genius of that ending, that Ian heard this phone call with an assistant where he's just saying, what else? What else? What else? And recognize that as a sort of, it's like Beckett, And that's he's a man who's stuck, screaming at the universe, what else, what else, what else? And he's the star of a hit show.
Did you know how helpful that scene would be while you were witnessing it?
Maybe that felt good. I mean, I don't know. Probably Daniel kind of led me there. I was just remembering that a piece on a profile where the first sentence was, this man, not the words, but the idea that the man commits suicide.
Yeah.
And it was my first sentence, the subject of the piece. And Daniel said, well, that's very good, yes, good, nice. Well, how about, the last sentence? Which is what happened in the end.
Yeah.
The last sentence of the piece. So, it's probably done.
Yeah, we do change things around sometimes. Actually, but let's talk.
That's what I thought this was. When I was summoned to a Sunday morning meeting about profile writing, I thought it was more of a remedial situation, maybe a performance improvement plan or something.
Yes.
I didn't know what was happening.
I hear what you're saying, Michael, in some ways that it's important to kind of get past the neurosis of the lead. But every once in a while, there is a bravura one that I, as an editor, think about still years later. And one of them, then, for me, is Larissa's, the opening of your profile of Hilary Mantel. And in part because, the most cliched form of opening is, it was a cool, crisp day in November. Where surprising that it was cool and crisp in November. It's like you don't want to do that. But Larissa's opening on this it's almost like an essay about the perils of daring, in particular as a woman, to write about historical fiction. And it's kind of this. And I encourage you all to look at it, but it's sort of it just explains, particularly in the way that the literary community might perceive writing about historical fiction, that it's maybe a kitschier genre, that it doesn't have quite the level of respect, but you kind of write about, and also the risks of, sort of daring to kind of immerse oneself in the past. What made you approach the piece that way? It doesn't even mention her name in that kind of opening. It's sort of an abstract, if you were to consider writing historical fiction, here are some of the challenges one might face. What did you think?
And if there's young writers in the audience, if you're not Larissa and you're considering starting your profile with a mini essay about your thoughts about the topic in general, it's a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
I mean, the honest answer is I have no idea and I don't remember. But
yeah.
I mean, I think this was one of the incredibly fun things about my job is that I was like, oh, I'm getting paid to read all of Hilary Mantel's novels for a month. It was so thrilling. And in the process, I became a complete raving evangelist for her work. And I was really just wanted to grab everyone by the throat and say, why haven't you read everything she's done? And the fact was that I had not read anything of hers because, and this was the mini essay was about why we think historical fiction is kind of tacky. Because I had thought historical fiction was kind of tacky. And if I see a cover of a novel that has a lady with, historical clothing on, I'm like, oy, oy, oy. And it just seems it just seems annoying. And I'm like, why are you setting something in the 15th century? Like, what's the point? Why not just write about the present? And so I wanted to, it was partly an evangelical impulse that I wanted people to, and now, of course, now she's hugely famous and it's not necessary, but I wanted everyone to be sure to read Hilary Mantel because she was, sadly, she died too young, but she was one of the best, maybe the best living crafter of English sentences. And also she was, I mean, I couldn't understand why she hadn't been famous earlier. And so I was interested in that too. And I think one of the reasons is like, I mean, I don't know how many people here have read a lot of her work, but like, you know, it's almost as though each book could have been written by a different person. And that's a terrible career move as a writer because, you know, if you read novel A and you loved it and you go out and get novel B and it's nothing like it and you're like, what? And you just don't read any more by her. Or if you hated novel A, but you would have loved novel B, but you never read novel B because you hated novel A. And so I guess I just wanted people to read her. And
Yes.
I became really boring on that subject. I was like, I talked about nothing else for months.
What's remarkable is that, you know, what Larissa just said for the past 4 minutes has been distilled and compressed into 700 words. No, I'm saying...
But who's counting?
And what
Shut
I'm
up,
saying is
Daniel.
that part of what we do
He's editing you.
is actually...
He's so annoying.
is distill, our thoughts into in a compressed way.
But I was wondering about your enthusiasm. Like, I only profile people I find interesting, right? I've never written a profile that sets out to tell readers, like, this person is boring and stupid and they stink, right? Like, on some level, I've got to find the person interesting and compelling. But do any of you have moments during the writing process when you have second thoughts and you're like, oh, is this person maybe, like, not that smart? Is this person maybe not that interesting? And then you kind of, like, work through that to regain your original enthusiasm?
When the photos have already been taken. Yeah.
No, like in the reporting process, and you kind of like, right, and then you're like reading that novel or you're watching that film with a new eye, and you're like, wait, is this good? Is this the right person? Did I make the right choice? Do you never have that feeling?
Oh, I mean, I don't think I've ever given up on a piece, but that's not.
No, I mean in the middle.
But that's not. That's not to my credit. That's just because it's my job to get it done. So.
Well, David Remnick says that once they buy an airplane ticket, something is going to be written, right? Like that's the rule.
That's true. Well, no, that's true. We do kill things on occasion, but one thing I also wanted to ask about was the way that someone's biography can in some ways be the point of a profile. You know, we sometimes think about it being like, you know, it's this drama of this immediate encounter and sort of what you said there, but sometimes, you know, just telling the life story of somebody in a kind of longitudinal, careful way allows you, I think, with a profile, and I think a lot of like there's a lot of Rebecca's pieces recently. You know, sometimes she'll write about an artist. There was a recent profile of an artist who was painting in her 90s, an Italian artist. And it wasn't necessarily a piece, her name is Isabella Ducrot, but it wasn't making the same claim that she was Matisse, the way that another kind of profile that you recently did of Jenny Saville is saying this is a major, major artist. But it's in a way, she's a character whose life story tells you something about women's creative lives and why they may start late. How much do you guys think about, you know, sort of the full story and sort of how it might, you know, in Rebecca, like, did you realize in Isabella Ducrot, like, there was a story that actually a lot of men and women especially would find sort of inspiring in her story?
Yes, I did. I mean, that piece was one of the most extraordinary reporting experiences of my life. She's now 94. She didn't start making art until she was in her late 50s, into her 60s, and she didn't achieve any fame at all, really, outside a little bit in Roman society to which she belonged, until she was in her mid-80s. And you know, it sounded intriguing, so I arranged to go to Rome where she lives and I'd set up a lunch to have lunch with her. She's the same age as my mother. My mother's very frail, and I imagined that Isabella would not have the energy for, more than this lunch, and then maybe we would see each other again. But I wasn't expecting, I didn't think that, also, she hasn't got that much time. Her time is short, and how much is she going to give to me? Anyway, I told her I was going to go for lunch. She asked me when my plane was coming in and said, did I want to come over for a drink the evening before? So I came over to her beautiful apartment on the top floor of the Dora Pamphili Palazzo. If anybody knows Rome, that's quite the place to live. The apartment was full of Baroque paintings that she and her husband had collected back in the 70s when you could pick up an Artemisia Gentileschi for not that much money. And her place was amazing. But I walked through the door and she said to me, I am in love with you already. And by the end of by 20 minutes in, I was in love with her. And we had this 4 days of me asking her questions about her life and her telling me everything about her life and talking, because she was, she's still alive and she's still working, but because she was living in this, as she described it, this liminal state where she's between being alive and, on the brink of being dead, and she can't think about the future because there probably isn't much of a future. It was very meaningful for her to have the chance to sit with somebody and tell her whole story and tell them she'd had an incredibly interesting life. And it was this extraordinary, there's a cliche about, that as reporters we go and you sort of fall in love a little bit with the person that you're writing about, or maybe you have to feel like you do for a little bit, and then you go away and you have to write it, and you have to separate that sense of, or that feeling evaporates, because now your libidinal energy is going towards the piece that you're writing, and that's where the joy and the pleasure and the thing that we love to do. What we love to do, it's not to go around talking to people. What we love to do is sit down at the page and write the thing. But in this case, I'm still in love with her, and I wrote the piece in a state of being in love with her, and I don't think it made for a lesser piece. So.
Yeah. No, and one of the lovely things about it is that, and I think why people found it resonant, was that it was able to say, women of a certain age are thought to have, at some point, sort of ended their narrative and become merely dispensers of adages and giving support to others. And her life kind of showed otherwise. And that's
one of the most original people I've ever met, and still learning everything in every moment. And she never once said a thing that I say too often, which is, well, in my day, it was like, she never anyway, an inspiration. So, yeah.
I'm in love with you already. Is that?
Why doesn't everyone start that way?
Kid Rock said that to me,
We would be such
actually.
suckers if everyone, why doesn't every subject do that? It would be so clever.
Kid Rock was holding a Budweiser, looking at me in the eyes.
Absolutely. You talked about the fact that a writer loves that moment. One person I know has referred to it as divorce at the keyboard, where you kind of, which I think is too harsh, as a way of thinking of the moment when you're kind of no longer in that tête-à-tête with a writer, with a subject, and kind of writing on your own. But nowadays, sometimes you're off on your own when you're writing. But we live in an age of digital omnipresence. We're now aware in a way that maybe, when you guys started writing profiles, it wasn't as much the case, that, Michael, there's like a legion of stans for every single person you write about, who is going to often leap on anything that you might say that doesn't agree with their vision. Has that affected the way that you write at all? Does it bother you? Are you able to brush it off?
I don't think it affects the way I write, but it's certainly a factor. I honestly didn't know that Jeremy Strong had a group of superfans who call themselves the Germs, Jermz. And they basically just they're still doing it. Like, I'm not on Twitter or X anymore, but they used to just constantly buzz around me. I hesitate to even bring them up. Hi, guys. But like, it was so fascinating to me that they just weren't willing to believe anything I was telling them about this guy that they had decided was like their daddy, their guy, their boy, their number one boy. And I don't know. I mean, no. Did I let that sort of affect me the next time? I don't think so. I mean, I write about famous people. They often have fan bases. I think this is probably a much bigger factor with musicians. And, of course, it's a problem for music critics as well. I mean, I'm sort of curious how you think about fans of musicians that you write about.
I mean, I think of that world and of fans more as grist. Like, that's a subject, right? Because that's something that musicians are often thinking about, and that's part of what it is to be popular, is to be thinking about that or maybe shadow boxing with that, right? So when I profiled Grimes, this was way pre-Elon, but she was already kind of shadow boxing with her reputation and kind of spiraling or trying not to spiral or thinking about what people were saying about her. So I guess I think about it more on that end of like, this is something that the people I write about often have to think about and often have to encounter and pay attention to how they're talked about. And maybe that creates, in some cases, a higher level of self-consciousness, right? The people that we're writing about have spent a lot of time in a maybe slightly different way than in earlier generations thinking about how they are perceived and thinking honestly about how we fit into that. And part of the pitch that we can make is like, oh, well, this is something a little different. You're like, you can step outside of that back and forth, quick quote, quick interview. This is gonna feel more immersive. It's gonna feel more like a documentary. You'll be seen in a broader context. So yes, I don't worry so much about what is gonna happen after the piece, but it's definitely creates a lot of content. I love quoting Twitter. Like, I love the way Twitter grammar looks in the New Yorker typeface. Like, I love this, the way you're switching between registers and you have a slightly different language you can use than the language we use. So I like all of that.
All right, that's the matter of the digital whore, but then there's that human being who you have spent time with and then you've written about. Some journalists will say, if I get a rapturous note from the subject of my profile, I failed. It means that I've been too soft. Other people, really don't want that reaction of, you misunderstood me. Do you often hear from your subjects, and does their response really matter to you?
I mean, there is a sort of dream response, which is rare but welcome. I encourage anyone else to write the bit. Is there were bits there that made me a bit uncomfortable, but I thought it was very fair. Or my spouse said, "You got me." I mean, that's kind of the dream.
I thought the dream was when they make a Super Bowl commercial that is about the profile that you wrote.
Okay, that did happen.
For people who don't know, Jeremy Strong.
Okay, so I'll say, the aftermath of Jeremy Strong has been long and ongoing. Of course, there was a lot of talk, like the week or two it came out, and some of it I thought it would like make a splash, but like did not expect Jessica Chastain and Anne Hathaway and Aaron Sorkin to be coming to his defense publicly. Which honestly was all kind of exhilarating to me, because I was like, oh my God, Jessica Chastain is in on this now? That's fun. But then it's been really interesting. I haven't communicated. So I spent like 6 months on and off reporting that piece, and Jeremy would text me constantly. Like, he'd text me poems. He texted me a poem by Cecil Day Lewis and say, this is a poem by Daniel's dad. Like, it was incessant. And so when the piece came out, I thought, okay, I'll either get 30 texts tomorrow from him, or like never a single text ever again, and it was never again. However, he then has sort of responded to it in these really fascinating ways over the years. He did this play on Broadway called An Enemy of the People, an Ibsen play, and it's about a doctor who tries to warn a small town that their attraction in the town, their tourist attraction is toxic. This natural spring, and he's persecuted by the townspeople. And so it's not, I didn't think it had anything to do with my piece. And then he gave an interview with the New York Times and said, doing this play is my response to my experience with the New Yorker profile. I was like, it is? So then I went to see it, one of the strangest, the strangest theater-going experience of my life. And I watched this scene where, the character is in a town hall, and they all turn against him. And in this production, directed by Sam Gold, they actually put him in a box and dump ice cubes on him, and then pull away the sides of the box, and he's in the fetal position. And I thought, okay, so I get that. I get the instinct. What he
Please
felt.
tell me you were wearing a wig and sunglasses.
Yeah.
Borrowed it from Pete Wells.
And exactly. But I was like, okay, this is how he experienced this. That's what he thinks Twitter did or something. And maybe I'm the evil mayor or something who, he wanted people to see on some level that he was an innocent man, a righteous man who was misunderstood and persecuted. That's not the way that I experienced this whole thing. But, it's cool that it's this Ibsen production emerged from it. And then a year later, this past January, he released a Super Bowl ad for Dunkin' Donuts. I don't know if people remember this Super Bowl ad, but basically it's Casey and Ben Affleck are playing these sort of Boston bozo versions of themselves, and they knock on his dressing room door, and Jeremy is submerged in a giant cup of Dunkin' Donuts coffee grinds, and he comes out of it in this Apocalypse Now shot, and then says, I'm just trying to immerse myself in the beans. And they call it his bean method. And he's like, I'll be ready in about 3 hours. And it's a total parody of the version of himself that is in the profile, which I thought was such a fascinating response. And then on Super Bowl Sunday, he gave an interview to Vanity Fair, and he said something like, the reason I did this was to answer once and for all the accusation that I don't get the joke. Now, the web headline of our piece was, which at that point was 4 years old, was on Succession, Jeremy Strong doesn't get the joke. Because the whole thing was he wasn't treating it as comedy, he was treating it like Hamlet, as I said earlier. And so I just read this with my jaw open, what, 130 million people watched the Super Bowl. That's way more people than heard about this profile, read this profile, ever watched Succession. The scale of this is incredible to me. And so to have, inspired, provoked, both an Ibsen revival on Broadway and a Dunkin' Donuts Super Bowl ad, I can only feel a sort of honor. I don't know.
And I think
it's fueling him in some way, and I hope at some point he finds a way to sort of move on from it.
Well, we can announce now.
No.
It's something.
You're working with Dunkin' Donuts on a follow-up ad for this Super Bowl, I believe. Isn't that correct?
And 30 years from now, if there still are magazines, somebody will do a profile of Jeremy Strong, and his response to how he feels about you will be the bottom of the first section.
Absolutely. All right, well, I can't top that. So let's go to audience questions. Okay, I'm going to ask Ian this. Would you ever agree to be a subject of a New Yorker profile, knowing how it works?
No.
I think we're just going to start that off with the clean no, because I think I know what everyone else's answer is. Let's see.
Mine's yes, of course.
Yeah,
Of course.
But written by Ian?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kay.
Yeah, it's flattering, right? Even I was profiled in the New York Times. It's great. It's flat. Someone cares about my work and they want to write about me. Yeah, that same psychology that we notice in our subjects. Yes, I certainly have that.
Yeah.
Am I the only one? I don't know.
No, I get it.
Maybe
right.
when I'm 94.
All right. Some of these questions have a kind of fun game show aspect, so I'm just going to run with it. Michael, if you could profile anyone in the world right now, who would it be? I'm going to give you a few seconds to think while I vamp on this, which is that, sometimes people will ask me as an editor, sort of, why haven't you profiled Rihanna, or why haven't you, profiled this political figure? Well, a huge number of people do say no to us. It's particularly in an era of sort of walled-off publicists in which people have Instagram and other ways to communicate. So we often do, as writers and editors, have a wish list of people. Sometimes it takes, I remember Ian Parker spent probably 5 or 6 years trying to get Johnny Ive, the head designer of Apple, to agree to a profile. And we have a Google Doc of lists of people whose names I won't divulge, who we try every 6 months, every year, and ask again. So anyway, Michael, do you have somebody who...
There is someone, an actress who I have loved since childhood, who has been on my sort of life list, to use the Birder term, for many, many years. Whenever I've been asked this question, I would say her. And I'm not going to say who it is because I just got her. So I'm profiling her this spring.
Yes, excellent. Okay. Have you ever regretted anything you've written about someone in a profile that you wrote for the magazine? Either an observation or a detail that you shared that you thought in retrospect, either you got it wrong, like you realized in retrospect, because the more that you saw that person on the public stage, you came to think that you were not quite right, or in a kind of more moral sense that, maybe that was a little harsh.
I don't think so. I mean, that's not the same as saying that I would make the exact same judgments
Absolutely.
now, because I'm different and the person's different. And sometimes people's careers don't unfold the way you might have expected, and they go a different direction. But no, I can't say that I'm sitting up here being like, oh, I wish I'd done something different. There's people, if anything, there's people where if their career has changed enough, I'm like, oh, I would go back and reprofile that person now and see what their life is like now. So there's a little bit of that, but no, I don't feel that there's something like I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have written that.
It seems really weird to be like, no.
Yeah, I know.
Never any self-questioning. I mean, I do think that, one thing that I do have realized over the years is that you never know what someone's going to mind. Mm-hmm. It can be something you have no idea about that never occurs to you, which is why I try to, ask a lot of questions to forestall that, because especially if, again, it isn't a politician and I don't want to hurt them, I want to know. I mean, like one example that comes to mind, which didn't end up being in the final, I was writing about Stanley Fish, who is a wonderful literary theorist, and he went through the whole fact-checking process, and he was fine with everything, and he was like, the only thing I object to, and I hope we can fix, is I was married for X number of years to my first wife, and this is my New Yorker profile, and she's not mentioned in the piece. Can you put her in? And I was like, of course. I was like, oh, that would never have occurred to me. But things like that, like you just never know what someone's going to mind or someone feels weird about.
Yeah, I have two subjects who wrote me to kill the profile, like before it came out. They're like, yeah, I thought about it. I don't feel great about this, so I'd like to cancel the profile.
After it was fact-checked and the end of the process?
One was after it was fact-checked. One was before it was reported. Both ended up getting published. I was just like, well, okay. I don't think, in retrospect, either of them minded the profile that much. But yes, yes. Usually there's some jitters, but those are better jitters.
Well, there is this. Because of the process, the amazing process that we have at the New Yorker, with the fact-checking department going over everything with the subject, and I think even more now than they maybe did in the past, where the subject knows basically everything that is going into the piece or that's going to appear in it, but they don't know anything about how you have framed it, shaped it, how elegantly you have done it, and how it is not going to be excruciating, or maybe but that, I think, a lot of people do freak in that last moment where they just sort of get the list of facts.
Yeah, especially if they're not willing to
talk them down.
And especially if they're not willing to do fact-checking conversationally with the checker, and they're like, no, I want a list of facts. And then you get the list of 78 facts, and they're like, oh, this feels like a police report or something. And you're like, well, no, the checker didn't send you the sentence when I say that you're a genius. They just sent you the thing about why you got arrested. So, yes.
Yeah, I find that moment is always the moment when we have to sort of play therapists more than any, is when they are suddenly hit with, the checkers are all fantastic and have great bedside manner, but it's someone who they don't know, coming to them with like a laundry list of things, like the shirt they wore, what their mother said to them when they were 7, like everything. And it freaks them out because they're suddenly thinking, if you've done your job well enough, they think of it as a relationship they had with this person, and this is the moment when it's hitting them. Like this is a thing that's beyond my control. And so I always get a panicked phone call and have to reassure. Like I remember at that point in the process, Patti LuPone was asking, "Is this going to be a rollicking good time or a bitch fest from a bitter old lady?" And it's like the answer's both.
It's both.
I don't know.
Yeah. That's what I would say. It's interesting, as from the position of editor, I'm often in the position in which a writer has kind of received that sort of moment of blowback from someone who's seen the fact check, and I can never almost tell about my own role. Like, am I being sort of Machiavellian, or am I being honest when I often tell the writer, the thing is, you don't know in the end when you publish the piece what it is that's going to truly affect them. Often it's like the thing that they're kind of needling you or pleading with you about beforehand. That actually doesn't have an impact after publication, because the thing that is the sort of uncontrollable catalyst in the way that a piece enters the world is that other people read it, and other people have opinions about it, and other people send emails to the subject, and they say, "I can't believe you said that about me," or, "I hadn't realized that you were so short," whatever it is, and there's that one detail that you didn't think was going to be injurious at all.
But in my experience, the editor is usually the bad cop. In my experience, the editor is usually the one being like, "Fuck him, keep it in."
And no, I'm admitting,
But
I'm saying
that's what-
I'm definitely a proponent of leaving in details, but in part out of the argument, I'm saying, and maybe it's self-serving, that it's a bit of a lottery and you never know what it is and you can't control it. And so all you can do is sort of be honest as a writer and say, I believe that. And if you believe that and I think it's fair, then it seems to me the right choice is to leave it in.
I think that what happens is that we have the therapist moment, as you describe it, with the subject, and then Daniel's my editor, and I run to him and have the therapist moment with him, where he will say, no, this is okay. You're not, you're not doing a terrible thing to somebody here. And it's funny. We've had this whole conversation about writing profiles and the relationship between us and the subject that we're writing about, but we could have a whole other conversation about the third person in the room and the important role that they play as our foil, our sounding board, our encourager, our telling us to put the first sentence last sometimes. That's a whole other story.
That's nice. All right, this is a good question. You spend so much time with your subjects. How do you process your interviews? And I think the question in particular is, do you read, we now have these digital transcription devices that can use practically AI to, you don't have to sit there and retype every word listening to an audio tape. I wonder, A, do you guys use those, or do you actually want to experience the conversation in real time with the audio and the emotional inflections at every beat? Okay, you're
Both.
Yeah.
I mean, I use the AI, but then I go through and listen to it, which is so unpleasant. Like, it's just
So bad.
emotionally, to listen to yourself interview someone, and every single goddamn question, you're like, well, I shouldn't have said that. I could have phrased that better. Like, I should have followed up on this.
Or the worst thing is when you interrupt someone and you hear them and you're sitting there in your own
Yes.
house and they're like, and then I took the knife and I walked towards him and you're like, what's your favorite color? And you just totally ruined the moment and you're so embarrassed. But like part of the advantage of working for the New Yorker is you usually get another chance. And the nice thing about that AI software, which is terrible, so you do still have to, you do still have to listen to the thing. It just speeds up the transcription. But the amazing thing about that is what you can do, which we didn't used to be able to do, is if you're on a reporting trip and you're with somebody and you're going to interview them on Monday and Tuesday, on Monday night, you can transcribe the interviews from that day and so realize all the stupid things you said and all the chances you missed and all the times you spaced out because you were thinking about how hungry you were and you wanted lunch. And then you get to try to
because one
do
thing
it
I've
again.
noticed from that experience myself is that you often, an interview, because it's a charged encounter, we're kind of electrified at the moment that it's happening, and there's a level of anxiety in it. You sometimes retain every word that someone said in one response and take it with you, and 3 days later you could quote it verbatim. But sometimes when you're listening to an interview again, you almost realize, I didn't even notice that the person said this at the time, and it's almost the absolute essence of what you're then going to make the profile of. So it's really important to
There's
do
also
that.
a little stagecraft where you can make it feel like the interview's over.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then you're just talking, right? It's like a little bit Columbo or something. One more thing, right? Like when and maybe you've packed up, or maybe you've stood up, or you're leaving the room. You can have a slightly different kind of conversation, even though you're not off the record, but you're just not sitting in like an interview situation, and that can change the kind of stuff you can get.
Absolutely. This question I want to ask to Ian, because I think you're particularly adept at this. It says, tell us about the process of choosing who in the subject sphere is helpful to interview to supplement the main interview. And, in a New Yorker narrative piece, I tend to discourage as an editor, and Ian naturally does this, to have 27 people say, I think this person is a very good painter, or this person is a terrible painter. It's really great to have sort of one person, often kind of surprising from that person's social sphere, who becomes a kind of chorus figure who kind of really seems to have a handle on who that person is. And how do you find those people?
Somebody who knows them well enough to feel comfortable to, tease them, to kind of draw attention to their absurdities and their vanities. That's what you want. I mean, you call that frenemy. I guess it's maybe just friend, right?
Yeah.
It's like a proper, it's just a proper friend who is kind of feels confident in his relationship or her relationship with a subject that they can.
Yeah, well, in some ways,
and it's not spilling the beans. It's not.
No.
But you do want to hear those words. That maybe I shouldn't say this.
Yeah.
Those are the magic words.
Well, yeah, and in some ways, the way to think about it is, we all have friends, and then we have other friends, and then we talk about that one friend with the other friend. And there's both the times when you're being unfair, but then there's the times when you're kind of expressing in an independent way with affection and kind of earned information something about that person that you might not say directly to that person, and that's often what you're looking for.
But often, if you get them in the room together, that's often when it works really well.
Yes,
in fact,
absolutely.
because they can see that the subject is reacting without great fear, or or a parent, or a child. You could just get them to start talking.
Yeah.
And kind of, I think that's easier maybe than them kind of coming to you separately and saying, I should tell you about that time you went to jail, as you say.
Another good question here. We've talked with Isabelle Ducrot. You talked about falling in love with her falling in love with you, and therefore it being a kind of swooning experience from start to finish. But in the same way that when you kind of read accounts of film sets and you learn that Nicole Kidman and her director were at odds from day one, and then there was a kind of froideur or overt tension that kind of marked the relationship, but they were both committed to the project and they worked on it. Sometimes. I wonder, have you ever had that feeling that the subject, has committed to the project, but doesn't like you very much, or isn't enjoying the process, and that it's actually become a kind of hostile encounter that makes you uncomfortable? Have you ever had that, Rebecca? You're smiling, so.
Well, I mean, it's not exactly that intense, but I mean, I did a profile of the fashion designer Jonathan Anderson about a year ago, and we had been trying to get the piece for a while, and then he agreed to do it, and there was just this endless process of trying to get time with him, and then I got an hour and a half with him walking through a museum. There was supposed to be a second follow-up, and it never materialized. And so I mean, as I was sort of reporting the piece and thinking about the piece, I was just getting more and more irritated by this, sense of don't agree to do it if you're not going to do it. And one of the things I wrote in the piece as a sort of expression of my frustration with this was that, I'd been promised these interviews, and and the interview didn't materialize, but every time I went to a place where he was doing something, I would get sent these beautiful flowers from Loewe, these amazing flowers. And, I wrote the piece comes out, and then I got a note from the publicist afterwards saying, I hadn't realized that you had felt that you felt like you hadn't had enough, and I'm really sorry. And what's your address? Because we'd like to send you some flowers.
You know what? I mean, the thing I hate most is if I'm sure everyone will recognize this, when you finish an interview and someone says, "Did you get what you need?" Oh, don't you hate that?
Yeah.
And you feel so sordid. And so, like, have you got enough? Like, is your cup of stuff full or something? Oh.
Yeah, well, in some ways, that's the relationship that many subjects have with a lot of journalists, that they're kind of one and done. There is a feeling sometimes, when you look at like cinematic depictions of journalists, they're often, venal opportunists who sleep with their subjects or, whatnot. Some journalists do, apparently. But, that is the kind of thing that you're trying, in the profile encounter, to dispel a bit. How important is it to convey a feeling to them that, you have a level of sort of, that you've done your homework, that you've studied up in a way that makes you distinct from your kind? Like, do you have that anxiety? Do you think I need to distinguish myself and kind of rehabilitate the image of journalist for this person who might think of myself as a kind of either a gnat or,
Stalker is the word that you sometimes get.
Yeah, stalker,
This is my stalker. I've had people say that.
Emails that start "Dear Stalker," but in a friendly way.
How do you get your interviewees to agree to show up again and again? Do you lay that out as a request from the beginning?
Yeah.
Always? Okay, yeah.
I love to profile people who are not New Yorker subscribers. Yeah. And often their PR people are not New Yorker subscribers. I can always tell because sometimes the PR person will ask if I can put their client on the cover.
Yeah.
And I have to say not.
Do they have a monocle?
Well, I say, do they know how to paint?
Yeah.
And so, yes, the shorthand is usually like that it's a little bit like a documentary. And
It's
so
a really
there's
good
going to...
line. Yeah, I'm going to use that.
Oh, really? And so, yeah, there's going to be a bunch of scenes and different kinds of scenes in different places. Although also, at least for me, maybe you guys are better at your jobs than I am at mine, I am always feeling like I don't have enough access, that I'm only getting glimpses, that what I want is like to live with this person for a month, and instead I'm meeting them 3 times for 90 minutes each in different places, and somehow I've got to use these glimpses to make it seem like I'm really living with this person. So that question of access, it's always a question, it's always a negotiation, and to me, it always feels like not quite enough, and when I can actually like finish a piece and maybe at the last minute be like, oh, that's not bad. That's the only time when I feel like I've actually gotten enough access. During the process, I'm always like, no, I need to see more things. I didn't see the right things. I didn't get the right scene.
Something I've noticed over the years is I think a lot of people think of themselves as very good readers, but terrible interviewers. And I think it's because when you're confronted with another human being, it is so obvious how little you know. It's so obvious that you're just completely scratching at the surface. Whereas when you read a book, you can sometimes have the illusion like, I read it twice, I read it 3 times, I really know this book back to front. And you never have that feeling with a person, right?
Yeah.
And this is we'll end on this kind of one question that I realized in that kind of self-loathing way of the interviewer that I forgot to ask, which is, a lot of profiles, particularly nowadays, contain a lot of first person. Sometimes in which the profile writer is practically a character, a relatable character for the reader to latch onto. But some profile writers at the New Yorker really don't like to have first person in there. Do any of you have a kind of aversion to that? And is it even a rule? Larissa, I can't believe I guessed the right one. But tell me about it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's because if you have yourself as the character of the journalist in the piece, it can be incredibly generative because you have the I mean, Janet Malcolm is the sort of the ultimate theorist of this. Of what interested her most of all was the interaction between the journalist and the subject, and she spun all kinds of incredible pieces from that emotional tension, but that's not what interests me. What I want to do is try to figure out what the world looks like to the person I'm meeting with.
Yeah.
And the way to convey that is to take myself out of the piece, because if I'm there, I'm the reader's proxy. Like, the reader and I are the both outsiders looking in, which is in fact the situation. But like, if you want to give a sense of what it's like to be that person, as opposed to what it's like to be in the room with that person, interacting with that person, which is another super interesting thing, but a different thing, you know, then you've got to take yourself out and even take out, like, you know, for instance, if they say something to you, you would think that the most intimate access to somebody would be something that they said, because it comes right out of their mouth, it comes right out of their mind, more intimate than anything you could say. But if instead of putting it as a quote, which puts the reader implicitly in the position of looking at that person from the outside, but paraphrase it as, instead of he said, quote, X, you say he was thinking X or he thought X, immediately you feel closer to the person. You feel that you're looking at the world with them rather than at them saying something. And so it all depends on what you want to do. You know, I think with an actor, that is not usually what you want to do, because the whole thing about the actor, the whole reason you're with them and interested in them and want to write about them in the first place is what they look like in the very deep sense, is like how they project themselves and how you feel looking at them and how they think about you looking at them. And it would be absurd to take yourself out of that dynamic. But with other kinds of people, it may be what you want to do.
I was surprised when the New Yorker assigned me to profile you. I didn't mention this to you. But this panel has been really useful reporting for that project.
All right. All right, well, we're out of time, so thank you very much for coming. Thank you.